Welcome to International Human Rights Law. Human rights are an important practice area in international law. While they continue to be somewhat controversial in their philosophical foundations, human rights are in many ways indispensable from a practical point of view in a world made up of modern nation-states. In this lecture podcast series, I would like to provide some background and shed some light on the different systems of international human rights protection. We have a whole program to go through. Let me pull out my blackboard. To start with, we can say that the concept of human rights is rooted in natural law theories, in Enlightenment philosophy, and in an individualistic focus on rights rather than duties. These two statements are typical. The English philosopher John Locke, who lived in the 17th century and is widely regarded as one of the most important representatives of Enlightenment philosophy, put it that way. All men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights, among which are the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. And Thomas Jefferson, who drafted the American Declaration of Independence, expressed similar thoughts in these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are perfect examples of what we call the natural law approach, according to which legal rules are thought to be derived from pre-existing principles that are considered given by nature. However, the idea of human rights as self-evident and given by nature remains controversial. To give you an example, let's have a look at Alistair MacIntyre's famous critique. MacIntyre is a Scottish philosopher who was born in 1929 and lives in Glasgow, now aged over 90. Speaking of human rights, he says in a book published in 1981 that there are no such natural rights, and belief in them is one with belief in witches and unicorns, so no better than believing in witches and unicorns. And he argues, saying that the best reason for asserting so bluntly that there are no such rights is indeed of precisely the same type as the best reason which we possess for asserting that there are no witches, and the best reason which we possess for asserting that there are no unicorns. Every attempt to give good reasons for believing that there are such rights has failed. Another well-known example is the influential English philosopher, jurist, and social reformer Jeremy Bentham, who lived in the second half of the 18th and the first 3 decades of the 19th century. He called the idea of human rights as natural rights nonsense on stilts, and he regarded it even as a dangerous legitimization of selfish behavior. Speaking of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen of 1789, he says, "To say to the selfish passions there, everywhere, is your prey. Such is the morality of this celebrated manifesto." It's an ongoing debate whether human rights are given by nature or ideological constructions, whether they are self-evident truths or baseless imaginations, whether they are highest moral standards or tainted with hypocrisy, whether they are a prerequisite of dignity or a display of selfishness, whether they are universal values or rather an outpouring of Western arrogance. All of this and other philosophical questions remain unresolved, but what is not in doubt is that human rights play a central role in legal practice at the national and the international levels. And there is a reason for this, which has to do with Leviathan. Let me explain by giving you some historical background. What you have on the blackboard is a timeline of the past 5 centuries, starting in early modern times with the Protestant Reformation triggering religious wars in roughly all of Western Europe. Amid the general insecurity, people started to place their hopes in a strong state authority, which in turn contributed to the rise of modern nation-states in Western Europe. Nation-states that, after the 30 Years' War, came to be integrated in the Westphalian system established by the 1648 Peace of Westphalia. But other wars followed, namely the English Civil War. On the other hand, nation-states continued to grow more powerful, leading up to the age of absolutism, a role model for European states that was finally blown up in the age of revolutions towards the end of the 18th century with bloody revolutions and revolutionary wars. And revolutions didn't lead to weaker states. On the contrary, the states that emerged from revolutions continued to extend their grip on society, with state power tending to pervade all aspects of social life. And throughout the 19th century, nationalism worked at reinforcing the emotional bonds between states and their citizens, which further strengthened the nation-states and also increased the likelihood of clashes between different states, a tension that in the 20th century exploded in the two world wars. The post-war world order put in place after 1945 has not abolished the nation states, but rather combined them with a whole network of international organizations. In this whole development, there is one notable constant: the ever-increasing power of modern nation-states, and this has important implications. Historically, the idea of human rights developed against the background of the formation of sovereign and increasingly powerful nation-states. Let's have a closer look at some of the steps in the whole development that forms the background of the emergence of human rights. A major step was the invention of the concept of sovereignty in the 16th century. A Frenchman, Jean Bodin, came up with that concept in his book entitled Six Livres de la République, published in Paris in 1576. Jean Bodin wrote against the background of the terrible religious wars of the 16th century that raged first in Germany and then in France, with the atrocities and the massacres you can see on the pictures. Against this backdrop, Jean Bodin came to be convinced that the only way of guaranteeing peace and security was to have a strong monarch who could exercise overwhelming state power and was able to establish law and order. In a word, what he thought was needed was a sovereign monarch. And here you have Bodin's definition of sovereignty. According to him, sovereignty is the most high, absolute, and perpetual power over citizens and subjects in a commonwealth. That is to say, the greatest power to command. Let's turn back to the blackboard. And well, as you can see, the state power faded away a little bit, but it is still very much there in the background. Jean Baudin, here you have him, the inventor of the concept of sovereignty that boosted the rise of modern nation states and laid also the groundwork for the later age of absolutism. Another major step in the whole development was Thomas Hobbes' famous book Leviathan, published in 1651, a book that came to be immensely influential. Thomas Hobbes wrote against the background of the English Civil War, and also this was a time of general insecurity, and Hobbes, being a rather anxious man, saw the only way of avoiding insecurity by having a Leviathan, a potentially all-powerful state. And here you have how Thomas Hobbes explains the necessity of such a Leviathan in his own words. Out of civil states there is always war of everyone against everyone. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, and such a war as is of every man against every man. For war consists not in battle only, or in the act of fighting, but in a tract of time, wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. For as the nature of foul weather lies not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereto of many days together, so the nature of war consists not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto during all the time there is no assurance to the contrary. In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That is probably the most famous passage out of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Let's place him on our timeline. You have him here, and he is one of the major contributors to creating the conditions for the age of absolutism. However, such a Leviathan is also somewhat frightening. There is a need for protection against such a potentially all-powerful state. And this is what we are going to discuss in the next part. See you soon there.